We're just going to start by having a little conversation here for a few minutes, and that's to give you a chance to think of what questions you'd like to ask, having come out of the films, as it were. One thing I'd just like to say before I start, because I otherwise forget at the end, which is all these films are now available online through the WOW Film Festival website. So if you're interested in them or see them again, you can see them again, or if you'd like to share them with any friends, either around the UK or indeed globally, you can see them for free. It's a kind of pay what you feel approach, so if you want to make a donation, you can make a donation, or you can just watch them. But do please share them with other people if you're interested. Where are we going to start? Let's start with Pierre, because we haven't seen Pierre before. Just give us your reaction to the films, just as a group of films.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone can hear me. Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously the first three movies were kind of quite nicely tied together, because they tell essentially the same story, but different aspects of it. I think I was really struck by in particular, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the movie that we produced, but the second movie was really, I was really struck by the way it kind of contextualizes, the need for these sort of protection strategies, and focuses on the Minga, but first of all, it sort of shows this context in which these protection practices emerged. And it ties quite nicely also with the second one, with the third one, which focuses on it seems to me on the role of women, and so it provides this kind of gender perspective. In a way, they do a bit what we are going to do also in the following two movies of the Ritualizing Protection Project. But I really liked. I mean, I've got Act One is a bit in my heart. I was there, a few years ago, so yeah. I know perfectly the context, and I was personally in one of the. I witnessed personally some of like an attack by settlers against a community. I wasn't there in any sort of protective role, but it was just fortuitous. But it's I thought it was very, very powerful. I think even what's interesting for me, it's also the role of documentation through video, how that sort of represents a form of visibilizing these situations, providing visibility to these situations, and sort of challenge a bit. First of all, challenge the narrative, but also provide that that much needed protection. Stop there. I've spoken too much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted that you've been in South Hebron and in this village, Twani. Well, the first thing that I wanted to say is, all the film dealing with displacement, and at this moment we have, and protection, and at this moment we have 2 million and more Palestinians in Gaza who are actually not safe, not feeling protected, and in fact being, there is a genocide really practice against them, and there is a sort of a situation where we have famine and hunger, while it is not it's not a natural disaster. It's a handmade sort of famine by war, and we have the food waiting around Gaza with different entries, and unfortunately, given all the pressure, these trucks are not able to enter to Gaza. To the films, so that there is issue which I think a thread of the displacement in all of them, the threat of displacement, indigenous communities. I mean, the film from Palestine is dealing with the Palestinian indigenous community, and specifically it's a Bedouin and farmer community which is facing an immediate risk of ethnic cleansing. So that I saw that as a thread through all the films. What really made me so pleased is to hear about the Minga, which is been mentioned in our film. We didn't focus on it, but what we call the faza'a. Faza'a is when you call, you shout, you call for the community to come to support you. Now, that could take the form of the harvesting, the cultivation, even if you want to weddings, so people will bring pots and plates and whatever. If you want to build something, you make a faza'a, so everybody could come to help you construct that. So I was absolutely touched by that. Made me want to know more about the Minga. Okay, I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much. The first 3 films I've seen for the first time today, and it's just amazing what has come out of these projects, so I'm quite touched, and also how well different kind of countries speak to each other, the experiences of communities in situations of violence, which are so similar. When you formulate a project like this, you have to kind of really think about, so what's the core of what we want to understand? So I had a very narrow idea of what we wanted to do, which was to look at kind of non-violent forms of protecting from physical violence. But as you've seen in all of the 4 films, physical violence is kind of the context within which we work as projects. But there's much more going on. There are all these kind of structural violences going on. I think that also was very strong in the first film, Pier's film, all this kind of the lure of the drug and the money that comes through drug cultivation, and how do you get away from that. We heard about young people being recruited by armed groups, perhaps because it sounds good. They get paid perhaps more than when they stay at home, or whatever it is that attracts them and so on. So I think you can see on the one hand how the vulnerabilities to violence are not just kind of the physical violence as such, but all these kind of structural violences that they are embedded in. But you can also see how unarmed civilian protection is not a kind of a toolbox of things of what people do, but it's a way of life, right? And it's very much collective. In all of the places we've seen, it is tied around identity. And being on the land, not being displaced, working the land where you've lived, it's pervivir, it's being there over time, and kind of staying with that land where you are is very, very important. It's very important for many, many people around the world. So I think thinking about protecting people is also thinking about protecting land, protecting nature, protecting water, as we've seen on Friday. So I think that's a very important thread as well. Another important one is how important culture is. So these practices are they are not taken from some university has come up with it, or some government has come up with it and has handed it to people, but it's rooted, the practices of protection and the practices of living together are rooted in cultures, right? So people do what they've always done, but now they use it not just to build houses, but also to come together to help protect people from violence. So I thought that was very strong in all of these films as well. And finally, I think the films also help us to start thinking about protection in different terms. So the kind of the first association many people still have when they think about protections, either the person protecting is one who has a weapon, or it's maybe the man who protects the rest. But here you can see the super important role of women in all of these cases. You could see the role that youth can have in protection. So youth don't have to be the ones who are vulnerable to being recruited into armed groups. They can also be the ones who are strong and help protect their communities non-violently. And I think it undoes a lot of what we think about when we think protection. It just goes to show there are other ways of thinking this, and I'm really pleased to see that that's one of the findings that so many different projects had. Maybe also just to briefly say, the second film about the Minga is a participatory filmmaking project. So the film was made with and by the community that Juan Mario worked with. So they had a film festival in Cali where they invited different other groups who had done participatory filmmaking as well to show their films. So I think that was also quite successful. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up a little bit on what you three have said, which is the connections there with the indigenous, particularly kind of approaches, and that it's not something from outside, and the connection you saw with Minga, and and particularly maybe just come back to you and the pervivere and pervivencia. That there seemed to be a sort of different sense of time and how people existed in the world, and I just wondered if you could sort of expand a little bit on how that's rooted somewhere different in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's something that, as you both were speaking, I think I started to think, which relates to in a way, that the sort of relational, the relation that exists between people and territory, people and land, and how protection, if we understand protection within that kind of framework, protection becomes not just protection of individuals, not just protection of communities, but it's a protection of identity, really, and that's really where the cultural elements comes in. No? I think it comes very strongly from your also from the documentary in Atuan. I think one of the last it concludes with something like
there's no alternative.
Exactly, we don't have any other land. No, so really, I think. And sorry if I'm kind of diverting a little bit from the question of temporality. Geographically, I think it's all the documentaries sort of underline this inextricable link between people and land, and how their identity is reliant and completely dependent from that. In terms of temporality and how existence is understood, that also relates to identity. I think at the very least, like in the sort of cosmovisions now of indigenous people, existence is not something that in a way happens in a given moment and concludes in a certain moment, and that's really what pervivencia means, is this idea of permanence, across time, and an attack on identity means, in a way, sort of jeopardizing that permanence, for present generation, for past generations, for future generations, So I think that's where the element of temporality comes in. I don't know whether this kind of answers or addresses a bit your question, but.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things about identity and sort of time. I mean, when you talk about the identity that I sort of saw in the films, are complex and have different manifestations. The identity of being a shepherd, the identity of being indigenous, the identity of being a farmer, the identity that you have certain relationship to the land and to the cultivation. So your understanding of time and temperature and weather, and these are all, connected. So it's not just about the national identity or the ethnic group identity, which is, I think, when the conflict, when we look at it in the macro, we overlook this type. I mentioned on Friday that still part of the identity of this community in South Hebron Hill in the West Bank is some of these communities still live in caves. And it is, I was there several times, and you can see why, the sense, the logic, that in the summer is cool inside, that it's a protection. It's one of the first important way of protection. The army, they couldn't come and destroy the house or the tent. They can destroy the house or the tent. It's very hard to destroy the cave. They tried, but it's much, much more difficult. So there is a sort of integral part of their existence is connected and interlinked to nature and to the environment. You mentioned about women. I saw in all of them the role and the power of women. and I think was very, very significant. There are, not many people know that in Palestine, women shepherd. Women go out with their flock, and it is very risky. It's also it's a lot of responsibility, to go out, and particularly in this context of attacks from settlers. So that's also power in a way, a lot of power by local community that we usually don't recognize.
Yeah, I thought there was also a strong theme of how protection and resistance go together, right? Yeah. I think there was a new film where somebody said, well, the Shiva, our army on the land, and like yes. We have to be visible. We can't just hide at home, right? Yeah. So there's something about unarmed civilian protection, but also kind of resistance against those forces that threaten people. So an immediate form of protection, if there's an attack, is of course to maybe hide at home or to run away. But if you live through that over decades and decades and decades, that doesn't become an option anymore. And in one of the Colombian films, also one of the women said, well, at some point you just have to kind of stand up and say, no, we don't want this anymore. You have to do something, because you can only hide so many times and run away so many times. So I think that like those things for me show the agency that people have, that people are not just victims, they have agency and they do something and want to do something. And I think the time aspect for me is also related to the knowledge aspect that came out in some of the films. So how knowledge is being transferred from generation to generation. Of course, you can learn, all of these groups have obviously engaged with academics as well, and so on. You learn all the time from different sources, but also kind of that ancestral knowledge about the plants and the birds and so on, and just about your environment, about that weather and so on, which is so important and sometimes gets lost. And I was struck when we received kind of applications for funding to our network, how many people applied with projects that wanted to systematize experiences. But I think this is exactly what it is, to kind of look back, what have people done over time, and what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what can we learn from that. So kind of connecting those times somehow, yeah.
Can I just build a little bit on something that Barry just mentioned, the idea of knowledge, and how that relates to temporality and risk. This is something that sort of came up quite often in the project. One of the main risks that NASA elders face relate exactly to this role of knowledge holders and this idea that knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation. When they transmit this knowledge, they become visible. All of a sudden they are in public places for the indigenous people, and that's what put them at risk. So the simple risk sort of forced them to hide. What that means is that knowledge is not transmitted, and so identity is diluted. It's lost bit by bit. That's one of the biggest risks. So I just wanted to add that. Sure.
Okay, so we're going to come over to you for some questions. Rachel here has a roving microphone, so if you could just put your hand up and she'll give you the microphone so everybody can hear your question. So, who is going to begin? Thank you.
Thank you. I wondered if you could comment on the ironies, or I don't know if that's the right word, of the role of the state in all of these cases. Protection, I'm thinking things like responsibility to protect, big international efforts by states to own the sense of protection. And yet it seemed very clearly in all of these cases the state is sometimes actively a threat, certainly in some cases, or complicit at least, in the forms of violence that are being faced, or just vacuous, not there, ignoring or looking sideways. So I wondered what you might say to the question of how these senses of the idea of protection could kind of contribute to international efforts to kind of redefine what is meant by protection and think international policy around protection, because it just seems to me that when this project goes to UN in a month's time or so, I I just wonder how it can speak to the ownership that states have for the language of protection, the tools of protection, the money for protection, when actually it seems to me that the real work of protection is elsewhere. So just wonder what your reflections might be. Thanks.
Yeah, I think thank you, very good question. I think there has to be a shift from the endless focus on the top level and the peacekeeping and peacebuilding and the top level. These examples and many other examples actually showing that grassroots, small scale protection, peacebuilding is critical and could do a lot. If we add solidarity, if we add international, if we add accompanier, if we add human rights, if we will add these other actors, I think we can put a strong case for an alternative, I don't want to say alternative, addition to already existing for a long time form of peacekeeping and protection. However, I think you are right. In certain contexts, sometimes the state, part of the violence, sometimes not, sometimes the state are complicit, and sometimes it is limited what we can do in terms of protection. Maybe it's a little islands, but it will be, but still, as many of the people that we interviewed, they said to us, this is very important for us to have somebody accompany us, be with us, understand us, solidarity with us, and more important, that they can take our case outside and advocate for it, raise awareness, talk about it, which is, to contribute really to change and wider sort of understanding of this dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. I want to say that I think obviously the two contexts, Colombia and Palestine, are very different in terms of what. So first of all, who the state is and what the state can do, in those particular situations. I'm going to say that in the case of Colombia, I mean, obviously there's been a history of state violence, obviously against indigenous people. At the same time, there's this kind of duality, because the state has a protection architecture. The state has a unit, a specific unit. It's called National Protection Unit, which provides, for example, leaders, even communities, with protection schemes. Whether these protection schemes work or not, it's a different thing. Now, what we encountered in the project, and part of our recommendations to the government, is that oftentimes these state protection measures are designed in a very kind of top-down and unilateral manner, without any sort of consultation with the community. Just to give you an example, Anna, the protagonist of the first documentary, she has a protection scheme. So in many of the scenes, we were inside this big fancy car. That's a National Protection Unit provided scheme. And we just heard a couple of days ago that the National Protection Unit withdrew the car. And one of the two bodyguards that she has. And this is inexplicable in this. You should know that in this particular moment in history, there's been a sort of intensification of violence against, especially in that particular region of Colombia, against indigenous communities. I think it was a week ago, 10 days ago. I lost a bit count of time, but a dissident group of the FARC attacked some, like a group of indigenous people, and some of them ended up in the hospital, and one eventually died, a woman, and like an elderly woman. And so the reason why I'm mentioning is this example, it's because like the withdrawal of the protection scheme has come as a surprise, without any sort of consultation, without any sort of explanation. And so really I think what we think is that the way we're thinking about the state is like as I don't think they could do the work that the community does, but they should come in consultation with the community to accompany, in a way, the protection measures that they already put in place.
I think one of the things that I've learned through this project and many other projects is, if you think about peace is not a state. It's neither a state with a small s nor with a capital S. Peace is kind of an ongoing struggle, and it's waged at different levels. So we see communities trying to figure out protection for themselves in situations where the state doesn't do what it should be doing. But we also see organizations like Corporación Jurídica Libertad, for example, doing a lot of strategic litigations, kind of cases against certain actors of the state, agencies of the state, to make them do their job, for example. And international accompanier groups then doing solidarity work and advocacy at the international level. So I think all of these have to come together. Because if we look at the legal frameworks, and you're more of the legal expert here than I am, the legal frameworks don't look so bad. They just have to be implemented, right? That's the main problem. We've come a long way in terms of codifying some of the things we want to happen so that civilians are protected in warfare, for example, and so on. But somebody has to make that happen, and I think that's the kind of the multi-level struggle. So it's not about the kind of grassroots level substituting any of the other levels, but it has to be taken seriously in order for protection schemes not to do more harm in the end than they did good for some time, and so on. And there's still this reluctance of kind of thinking about grassroots communities as agents in their own right, or people who know about their context. I mean, they know best about their context more than anyone else, but there's still this idea, oh, people don't know, they have to be protected, we have to protect them, and that's the problem. And that's what we try to undo with these projects and these fantastic films.
Okay, so any more questions? Somebody with a hand? Up at the back there. Thank you.
I'm unclear about the timescale for your whole piece of research, or how many times you engaged with different communities on the ground, but I'm assuming it had some sort of timescale to it. So my question is, how have you seen your engagement with these people on the ground impact on them and the way they think about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and where it's taking them? I know you mentioned that they were pleased that you were giving it a wider stage and an international stage, but in the day-to-day, what have you seen from their perspective about your engagement on the ground?
Yeah, no, thank you for our project. That was a very significant factor. We our first visit was in October, November 2022, and immediately after that, a new government being elected in Israel, right wing. I'd say some of the minister, I would say a fascist sort of politics. So, and that's then. We went the second visit in June 2023, and then later in October, post-October, which is 7 October, which obviously impacted on our work. So what we witnessed is sort of gradual increase in violence by the state and the settler until in October, November, and then June, and then dramatic sort of rise in violence after October the 7th. I'll give you a little anecdote. One of the people that we interviewed in middle of November, Shepherd. When we talk about hamlets, we talk about communities, maybe 10 people, maybe 15 people, maybe 20. The largest, where the village we went to, just like the capital in South Hebron, is less than 1,000 people. So we are talking small number of communities. They are very self-sufficient. So, in one of the villages, one of the hamlets, settlers came, attacked the family, and they made sort of destruction in the farm and in the house. But my view, or what they also reported to us, they asked them to stand and next to put Israeli flag and record statements that they are supporter of Israel, they are against, they have, to humiliate them. And then they spread it in social media. So these poor farmers being humiliated in sort of directly as individual by recording something that they don't believe, don't think that that's who they are, and condemning their people and community, and then share it in social media, which is, to me, that was, really horrific form of violence, towards this community. So that, to your point, we witnessed that, and that's definitely affected the way people respond. In October, there was no international, and very few Israeli solidarity groups started to come maybe by November, December. So it did have, immediate direct impact on them.
In terms of engagement, maybe I should kind of clarify how the project sort of unfolded. So the images that you've seen in camera, so part of them were shot by us in a 3-week field work back in I think this was February 2023. But there are a lot of footages that come from the community themselves. No, and this is big because the project was designed as a sort of collaborative, collaboratively essentially, in many different respects. Now, in terms of how I think our engagement impacted the community, I think that links to one of the I guess most surprising finding of the project, which was that the community themselves feel that they have lost part of these cultural and spiritual practices, no? And so one of the explicit asks that the community had was, can you sort of provide a platform for us, a space, resources to start re-engaging with those practices, to start with the rethinking? So one of the outputs of the project, I would say less immaterial, more immaterial outputs of the project, was the possibility for the community to meet in these. They're called Minga de Pensamiento. How do you translate that? It's a sort of brainstorming meeting, if you wish, no? That they have among younger generations, elders, and then the authorities, the indigenous authorities, no? And that has helped them to, as far as I understand, to rethink, how do we improve the traditional medicine? How do we recover, for example, certain seeds that we have lost? Do we have a certain way of accessing these, these resources that we no longer have access to? But also, how can we think about engaging more systematically with, for example, the protection of the elders? How can we provide them with a space where they can talk, but they feel protected as well? So I think that's probably the most impactful part of the immediately visible impactful part of the project. In terms of whether the recommendations will be taken up or not, obviously, as Barry was saying before, hopefully yes, but who knows?
Yeah,
the recommendations on the ground. The impact on the ground to the people on the ground is outside of whether the recommendations will be taken up at all. So it's an area in which the impact is really important.
Yeah, just to say about the network, so as the principal investigator of the network, we are financing 26 projects, but those 26 projects, I don't think there's any one among them where the people applying for the funding haven't worked with the groups they're working with in our project already, and where they don't kind of plan to continue working with them. So it's kind of one pot of funding that we can give to an ongoing process, and I think that was very important for the panel when they decided who to fund, that there was a sense that this is not a one-off kind of we parachute in, do a little research and then go back out. I mean, Marwan obviously has been working and like therefore
we'll continue.
We'll continue to work in the South Hebron Hills for many years more, and so I think that was very important to us. So there is this kind of continuity, but also the point you raised. So did people actually think about their practices as a form of unarmed civilian protection? We have so many projects. So we've already done 2 events now in Nairobi with Marwan's project and the projects we have from different African countries, and in Bangkok with the projects we have in Southeast Asia and 4 different Southeast Asian countries, where sometimes, yes, people were already thinking about their practices and unarmed civilian protection or community self-protection. In other cases, they almost discovered it all of a sudden as a concept that would describe what they had already been intuitively doing but didn't have a terminology for. So that has been really, really interesting. There's also a project, when you go to the exhibition, a project that is called Art That Protects in Medellin in Colombia, where the project was with artistic and cultural organizations who had thought about their work in terms of human rights defense and all sorts of things, but never in terms of creating safer spaces for people to live their life, creating more protection. And I think it has given people a bit more of a vocabulary to frame some of the part of what they're doing. So not to say it's the only thing they're doing, but we had somebody, the lady from Nigeria, at the meeting in Nairobi, who's a very well-known and highly connected woman in her community in Maiduguri in northern Nigeria, where Boko Haram have been active. And she stood up and said at some point, I didn't realize I was doing unarmed civilian protection, but I'm now going to do it in all the projects I'm doing and so on. So that was really quite inspiring to see.
Okay, so have we got one last question from anybody?
Hi. So a bit of a different one to do with like sort of the environment and how that links, but obviously the communities you work with they work a lot with the land, and that's where these protection schemes sort of base themselves is their relationship with the land and stuff like this, and self-sufficiency and farming and all that sort of thing. With environmental change globally and specifically in the regions involved, do you think they're going to have more difficulty maybe with their protection schemes if they're facing other risks from flooding or from failing crops and this sort of thing? And also, do you think that their dependence on the land will increase their sort of vulnerability, or do you think actually, because they know the land so well, because they've been working it for however many years and all this sort of thing, that they will find they'll be able to adapt more easily than maybe the general population will? So do you think, I guess, that it's a weakness or a strength, and how will they use that?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a wealth of traditional knowledge, ancestral knowledge that indigenous people in general, but I'm going to talk about the NASA people now, that they hold, in their sort of toolbox, if you want to call it that way. And I think actually what's happening, I think, is that climate change and the way that climate change is sort of manifesting at the local level is actually weakening their link to the land, and that's exactly what they're trying to fight for. I suppose that this idea of pervivir, this idea of permanence, and this inextricable link between a people and a territory, really sort of goes into that direction, sort of being able to survive, to remain permanent in this world means also to be able to preserve that territory. And in reality, without that territory, there wouldn't be a NASA indigenous people. No, it wouldn't be the same people. I think one of the interviewee in the video says it quite clearly. So I think that's part of their resistance, no, and that's part of the risk as well. I think in Colombia there are a number of natural reserves that where conservation efforts are kind of partly, how do you say, like sort of given to indigenous people. I remember having visited one of these, and it's actually the indigenous people that sort of make you enter that reserve. They guide you through that. Whether that's only a sort of cosmetic concession that the government provides them with or not, I think it's a bit of a more complex question. I'm not sure whether I'm answering exactly what you're asking, but I think that's the essence of what I would like to say.
I think the Bedouin and the farmer community in this area in south of Palestine, for years they lived in harmony with the land and with the nature, and they knew very, very well how not to harm the environment, and they knew very, very well that they're totally dependent on the environment in terms of water, use of water, how careful about even grazing. They know where to go, when to go, which month, which time of the year. But you can see that there is already that element of environmental impact on them, different aspects of it. One of them is, I would say, the larger numbers, say, of herds and that need grazing to go out. But adding to that, there is one way of confronting the Palestinian Bedouin is that the settler started to do herding. Suddenly, around the West Bank, particularly in the south, I was shocked because this is so much part of the Palestinian culture to have, go herding and to live on the land and livestock. Now you see settlements or posts which run by Israeli Jewish settlers that do the same thing. And they also learn during, there is an interesting report called The Wild West, if you are interested, that really monitor what happened in the last 10 years in this area. Now, the resources are limited in terms of grass, in terms of area, so that is a risk in the environment, that you will be using more and more and exploiting the environment in that way. I move between pessimist to optimist. And sometimes I'm a pessimist because I see, different factors comes together against its indigenous communities, including the environment, including the control and lack of resources, and the outside factor, the state, the violence, etc., which is in the end will force them to leave. And when they leave, then there will no continuity would be to this way of life. We already witnessing that young generation, not all of them want to go herding. I mean, there's enough, and I went with some, but the temptation is to say, oh, I will go and work in construction, or I can go to work in Israel as a laborer, because there is possibility to earn more. But and then you don't want to live there. You want to buy different things, and your whole life of style will change. You're not anymore producing cheese that you could keep. I mean, the cheese, you could keep it 12 months. You dry it, you keep it, and you could even different forms. So that is the risk, that gradually, slowly, this way of life would be very hard to maintain it in face of all the challenges, the internal ones, environmental one, and the external ones.
I mean, specifically at the meeting we had in Nairobi with the projects from Palestine and from Africa, that was a huge topic, because you can see that climate change has effects, but affects different regions differently, and it was a huge worry among the projects who were present there, what climate change does in terms of putting strain on the resources and then creating more conflict between communities that depend on those natural resources. But also what came out of those discussions was, and we actually had a keynote speaker, Professor Jackie McGlade, who works partly at a London-based university and partly at Strathmore University in Nairobi, and she used to be kind of a chief scientific advisor to United Nations. Well, she's married to a Maasai chief, and she's saying at the moment there's lots of rain here around Nairobi, and it's really bad for us because we're living in these mud huts, and the mud huts are not made to be here in a place where it rains all the time. So even that, like even your housing can be massively affected. But what we also discussed there was how unarmed civilian protection, so it is not just a reactive kind of practice where you wait for something to happen and then you try to kind of do the best to mitigate the kind of physical harm on people, but it can also work as a form of kind of prevention or a form of mitigation of conflict if it's used from the beginning. And what is at the heart of unarmed civilian protection of what people do is actually, you saw that in some of the films here, kind of this idea of talking to as many people as you can, building relationships with as many people. There was somebody on the phone actually saying, we want to come through, please let us through so that we can report what is happening here and so on. So it's about this kind of, as you plan for mitigation measures for what will happen with regard to climate-induced conflict, to already think about, okay, how are these different mitigation measures going to affect the different communities here, and how can we do this in a way that we don't do harm to anyone, we don't create more conflict, but actually lessen the conflict and create more cooperation. I mean, in the end, obviously, whether that's then enough in a situation of severe drought or what we've seen in some parts of Africa, I don't know. But there are forms to think. So unarmed civilian protection, as I said, it's not a toolbox, it's kind of a different way of thinking about how we relate to others. And I think that's kind of super important if we want to go forward also here. So we might not see the drought affecting us kind of personally because maybe we don't grow anything, but the prices will go up, for example. So we find that as well here, that whatever happens in other parts of the world will affect our way of living and how we survive. So I think we do need to do something, and thinking about things differently and thinking about them more as a kind of relation to others, I think is really super important. So thank you for that important question.
That seems like a good point to leave it on in terms of we all have to think about our connectedness and so on. So thanks to all of our panel, particularly for Barrett, for all this, bringing it all together.
Thank you for inviting us. And
it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.